I really look forward to talking today about Islamic education in South Asia and how it has been transformed over the course of the modern period. Akbar will abolish the jizya tribute on non-Muslims. He will restrict the slaughter of cows. The trajectory of Islamic education in South Asia begins to change with colonialism. Basically, the British government is using its funding to shape the curriculum to try and reshape the Islamic tradition. The Aligarh movement is basically producing a version of Islam that is too influenced by Western norms.
Originally, actually used to be called the Anglo-Mohammedan Oriental College, so it wasn't right away known as the Aligarh University. My understanding is that Anglo and then Mohammedan, and then you had also the word Oriental, which also kind of became unpopular, so it was renamed to Aligarh.
So when we're trying to compare the different movements like Aligarh and Ahlul Hadith and Nadwatul Ulama, they take different stances on which are the sources of Islam, authoritative Islamic teachings that are part of the canon.
The areas of Pakistan, there was Allama Panjshir, and people like them, they actually followed the same line through Shawla Tehlevi and had I believe they were pretty much Deobandi in a lot of things, but in some points of Aqidah, they were actually lean more to Ibn Taymiyyah.
The Deobandis in particular are so critical of what the British are doing that they really form these type of institutions that are designed to be maximally independent of any kind of government interference. Anyone who wants to understand the range of reactions among Muslim communities to the challenge of liberal modernity, really South Asia is the best place to look, and South Asia was really kind of at the forefront of dealing with these issues.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Welcome everybody to the Project Ihya podcast, this series on the global transformation in Islamic education, where we are once again here with our beloved Dr. Aria Nakissa. We want to thank also for spending and giving us his valuable time. Dr. Aria Nakissa is a lecturer in the faculties of Islamic Studies and Social Sciences. He holds a joint PhD in Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies and a JD from Harvard, as well as an MA in Islamic Law from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. He's a scholar of religion and law in Muslim societies, and his research pans the pre-modern and modern periods with a focus on the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He's the author of the Anthropology of Islamic Law, Oxford University Press, and he has published widely in leading journals across the Islamic studies, history, anthropology, religious studies, and cognitive sciences. He is also currently at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, where he currently teaches and oversees the PhD department, right? For the students studying at the International Islamic University of Indonesia. But without further ado, inshallah, today we are going to be talking about the transformation in Islamic education, primarily focusing on the on South Asia. So inshallah, without further ado, we're going to give the floor open to Dr. Arya, inshallah, for his presentation. Jazakumullah khair.
Yeah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I should say that just to qualify things a little bit in terms of my, I'm not, my position isn't necessarily heading up a PhD program. I'm at Indonesian International Islamic University, but I know I've also spent time at International Islamic University in Malaysia, so it's no problem. These institutions are all kind of part of one big family. At any rate, I really look forward to talking today about Islamic education in South Asia and how it has been transformed over the course of the modern period. I think maybe today's session is going to be a little bit is going to be especially interesting because I look at it as an opportunity to present some preliminary research, but also to get some feedback from people who are intimately familiar with Islamic education in the South Asian context. So, I'll put some ideas out there, get some feedback, and I hope to refine some of my findings and some of my ideas through discussions with the other scholars who are present today, including Asad and Tufail. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and let me pull up my slideshow. Okay. If I could be, yep, great. Okay, so we are going to talk about Islamic education in South Asia. And in order to understand Islamic education in South Asia today, a little bit of background information will be helpful. So when I talk about South Asia, I mean a area that encompasses the modern day states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. Muslims have had a long presence in these regions. Muslim armies conquered the westernmost areas of South Asia in the 8th century. And then in the succeeding centuries, there were a number of major Turkic and Turkic Mongol empires that further extended Muslim control across South Asia. So there was the Ghaznavid Empire, there was the Delhi Sultanate, which kind of extended Muslim rule across the northern portion of South Asia and intermittently took control of some of the more southern areas. And then you have the Mughal Empire, which basically lasts from the 1500s to 1800s. And the Mughal Empire basically establishes more stable Muslim rule over almost all of South Asia. Now, when we talk about these empires that conquered, these Muslim empires that conquered South Asia, they have some similar characteristics. These are empires that officially endorse Sunni Islam. They endorse the use of the Persian language and patronage of Persian literature and culture. Also, when we talk about the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, so two of these major empires, they are linked to the northern India region. So Muslim political power and cultural life is really concentrated in the northern portion of India, in and around this city of Delhi. And over time, due to Muslim conquests and Muslim preaching, about a quarter of the entire population in the South Asia region becomes Muslim. Most of these converts are converting from a type of Hinduism or proto-Hinduism. One of the interesting aspects of religious life, Muslim religious life in a South Asian context, is that a particular form of syncretism develops. So kind of you have these you have converts from a Hindu background coming in, and this helps stimulate the emergence of a Hindu-Islamic syncretism that is particularly pronounced in Sufi religious thought and practice. So you have a situation where Sufi Muslims in an Indian context will develop devotional music that is similar to that used by Hindus in their worship. You have a situation where, let's say, you have the Chishti Sufi saint Nizamuddin Awliya, who will adopt into his form of Sufism kind of Hindu yogic breathing exercises to help facilitate altered states of consciousness. You have a situation in South Asia where a significant number of Muslims, the way that the form of Islam that they practice is one which transgresses certain standard Sharia norms. So you have a significant portion of the population doing things like you can have Muslim men will often marry Hindu wives. Some of them will some of the groups that have converted into Islam will continue to observe Hindu caste regulations and rules against widow remarriage. and some will participate in Hindu festivals like Holi and the performance of Ram Leela. Uh, and you kind of this Hindu Islamic syncretism will reach its height around the 16th century, where you see resulting in a number of kind of famous developments. So it's at this period that you have kind of a syncretic poetry of Kabir that is produced. You have the religion of Sikhism emerge, which has a Hindu and Islamic elements. You also have the short-lived Din al-Ilahi, which was created by the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And when we look at some of these Mughal emperors, we see the extent to which Islam has entered into a kind of relationship with Hinduism. So, for instance, Akbar will abolish the jizya tribute on non-Muslims. He will restrict the slaughter of cows. And then the later heir apparent to the Mughal throne, Dara Shikoh, is famous for writing works that combine Sufi Islam and Vedantic Hinduism. And he will make claims that the Quran itself recognizes the authority or recognizes that certain basic forms of religious truth are contained in the Vedas. Nevertheless, you do have more standard orthodox forms of Islam in South Asia, which are very important. One significant figure that merits attention is the Naqshbandi Sufi Ahmed Sarhindi. He lives in the 7th century and pushes for a stricter commitment to Sharia norms, and also challenges some of the Sufi practices that are a bit more controversial, like the use of music in Sufi ritual. You also have the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb during the 18th century or during the 17th century, and he is going ahead and taking he's pushing back and rejecting some of the more syncretic Hindu Islamic practices that are endorsed by earlier Mughal emperors like Akbar. And this notion and this greater increasing commitment, or this movement to increase commitment to kind of orthodox scriptural forms of Islam. One of the figures that plays a great role in this is the 18th century figure Shah Waliullah ad-Dehlawi. So during this period, there are a number of movements across the world that are calling for greater commitment to greater adherence to Quran and Hadith, and which are critical of local syncretic practices. You see this across the world during the 18th century, and in a South Asian context, Shah Waliullah is really carrying the flag for this type of movement. The Muslim empires in South Asia are quite wealthy, and they direct an immense amount of funding to mosque and madrasas, which make South Asia a major hub of Islamic culture and Orthodox Islamic learning. On the eve of modernity, South Asia was home to a number of major institutions of Islamic learning that were concentrated in kind of the northern portion of India. Two of the most important were Lucknow's Farangi Mahal and Delhi's Madrasa Rahimiyya, which was associated with Shah Waliullah. However, the trajectory of Islamic education in South Asia begins to change with colonialism. During the late 18th century, the British begin systematically extending their rule across South Asia, gradually replacing the Muslim Mughal Empire as the governing power. And under British rule, South Asian Muslims are among the first Muslims in the world to come into contact with some of these Enlightenment technologies and forms of social organizations and ideas, including the liberal ideal of a civilizational progress. So many ideas, so you will have Muslims in different regions grappling with these aspects of Enlightenment modernity that are being globalized by the colonial empires, French, British, and Dutch. But the Muslims of India are kind of at the forefront. They are arguably the earliest group of Muslims that is dealing with these issues, because this is a region where the colonial powers, the British in particular, start penetrating quite early in comparison to other regions. One of the aspects of British rule in South Asia, as is the case in other regions, is the British want to encourage a type of reformed version of Islam, a form of Islam which maybe isn't so contrary to their liberal ideals of civilizational progress, which include a commitment to a scientific worldview, or a substantial commitment to a scientific worldview, and certain liberal human rights norms. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, one idea that is characteristic of all of the European empires that are governing the Muslim world, and the British in particular, is they say, if we want to encourage Muslims to develop the reformed form of Islam, a reformed type of Islam that is more consistent with the liberal ideal of civilizational progress, we need to change the way that their religious scholars, their religious authorities think. And the way that we can change that, is we will go ahead and alter the educational institutions. So I will discuss these changes, but the way that I will discuss them, so these changes that are brought about by the British in reforming Islamic education lead to responses among different Muslim groups in South Asian context. And there are kind of 5 movements that I want to give attention to that all represent responses to the colonial form of modernity that is brought by the British. All of them endorse a kind of a specific form of Islam, a specific approach to Islam. And all of them establish educational institutions to help propagate their particular form of Islam. Some of these educational institutions are established with the help of the British, and then some of these educational institutions are established in a way with the aim of actually kind of insulating themselves from any kind of British influence. So the 5 movements.
Sorry, before I wanted to ask actually a question about, I suppose, maybe methodology. Initially, you had mentioned about before Shah Wali Ullah Dehlawi, Nizamuddin Awliya, the suggestion that you made was that there are some syncretic practices, like, for example, some breathing yogic exercises. Do you have a kind of genealogy of, like, how do we know that those yogic practices were indeed syncretized and not something that Nizamuddin Awliya, as a person, let's say, leading a Sufi, silsila, like, not something that he himself came up with or something that he's inheriting from elsewhere? Do you have a particular genealogy on how?
So it's an interesting question. So one possibility is that breathing practices and the pursuit of altered states of consciousness that are associated with fana and ma'rifah actually theoretically originate at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or even among the Salaf. That's conceivable. And one of the reasons why that is worth considering is that many Muslim scholars themselves say, so of course, all of the Sufi tariqas claim to have some kind of chain that extends back often through Ali, or I believe in the case of, like, let's say the Naqshbandis, maybe Ali and Abu Bakr, to the Prophet ﷺ. And the idea is that in some sense, all of these practices are inspired by or consistent with the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. So the question is, where do these teachings come from? One possibility is that if we want to say that they come from the Prophet ﷺ, or let's say the first Muslim scholars in the first 2 or 3 centuries, we would look at the earliest Islamic text that can be securely dated. So obviously, in the first case, we have the Quran. The Quran does not appear, at least on my reading, I know that different people have different perspectives on this. To my reading, in the way that I read the Quran, I cannot see any explicit indications that Muslims should pursue a state of kind of like a fana, or an altered state of consciousness, where they would kind of disappear as a separate entity, and kind of disappear as a separate entity and kind of be absorbed into Allah as a form of cosmic oneness, or kind of experience that. So I can't see that in the Quran. Also, if you talk about the hadith material, where you're talking about accumulating over the first 2 centuries, can you find some hadith that talk about this matter? Yes, but not in a very explicit way. And even those that you might mention don't really talk about practices like, let's say, breathing exercises. So then after that, you would say, so this would be evidence that practices of this type are not really, don't develop somewhat later in Islamic history. Maybe forms of Sufi practices like this type are maybe establishing, or maybe developing in the 9th century, maybe are associated with figures like Junaid and Al-Hallaj and whatnot. And the question would be, what is their origin? And people have debated this issue for a long time. One possibility is that Muslim thinkers themselves are without any kind of influence, whether it is Christian monasticism or Hinduism. They are not kind of drawing on these traditions, but rather they're engaged. Rather, what they want to do is they want to attain certain emotional or Gnostic states, and they're experimenting with different ways to do so. So maybe one is going to be dhikr, maybe another could be use of certain music, maybe another might be certain forms of breathing exercises. And then in that sense, they come up with breathing exercises or forms of dhikr that are similar to what you have in other religious traditions. Because when we talk about Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, all of them seek altered states of consciousness through particular practices, and these practices have common features, including breathing exercises, including chanting something over and over again. So in a Muslim context, we might say it's dhikr. In a Hindu Buddhist context, we might say they're chanting a mantra. Also, ascetic practices are an important aspect of attaining these altered states of consciousness. So theoretically, one could say that, and I think this is correct, that if one wants to attain such an altered state of consciousness, one needs to use these type of practices. And it's conceivable that early Muslim mystics experimented with a number of different practices and came upon these practices, including breathing practices themselves. And it's for that reason why there is a similarity. That is the reason why there is a similarity between Islamic mysticism in this context and Buddhist mysticism and Hindu mysticism and Christian mysticism. So that is one option. And I wouldn't rule that out. The question would be, did Muslims develop these practices completely alone, or were they somehow aware of other forms of religiosity, and were those somehow shaping and influencing their practices? And I would say when they use the same types of terminology, or on top of that, when we see that there are kind of very distinctive aspects of these other religious practices. So let's say, for instance, Muslims start using particular instruments that are being used by Hindus to celebrate religious festivals. This would establish an overall pattern of influence. But you are correct in saying that methodologically, this has long been a debated issue. So people have on one extreme, you will have people saying these forms of Sufi belief and ritual are basically entirely foreign to Islam and just kind of adopted in by the outside. And then you'll have other people who are saying, no, these are entirely indigenous. In fact, they originate with the earliest Muslim thinkers and mystics and religious figures. And even if they're not directly, explicitly based on the Quran and Hadith, they're consistent with the spirit of these texts and were kind of generated indigenously by Muslim mystics.
Because
Yeah, I suppose my question is more like epistemological, right? Like basically that, if we cannot trace a direct genealogy that, let's say Nizamuddin Awliya or someone else, that they're actually, going and seeing some text of the, Hindu mystics and then adopting it, or if we do not see something at least indirect in the sense that, okay, this is being practiced in the subcontinent at the time, and then before his arrival this was not here, and after his interaction with them all of a sudden it is there. To some degree maybe we can kind of say, okay, there's a genealogy here. But I guess the reason why I'm asking this is, I remember there was a class that I was doing with at Columbia University where we discussed basically the it's called the requirement. It's called the principle of requirement. Basically, the Spanish, what they used to do before colonizing is they had like a 2-page document that they would read out in Spanish to indigenous peoples, and the document said things like, you have to give allegiance, you have to pledge allegiance to the King of Spain, and you have to accept Christianity as your religion, and because you haven't done so, then it is our full right to exterminate you and enslave you, because we've given you the message and you haven't taken it. Of course, these, poor South Americans had no idea what this person who showed up on a boat was reading to them because they simply did not speak Spanish. But the argument that was being made in one of the papers is that this was taken from Muslims because the Prophet ﷺ, he wrote letters to the kings, and he said, Aslim Taslam. And the argument that the author was making is that, because Muslims lived in Spain, so the Spanish colonizers basically got that from the Muslims. I found that to be like a very weak genealogy, in the sense that all you're saying is that, well, these people lived here, these other people also came to, live here afterwards. Certainly they must have gotten this practice, this entire document, of course, from this one particular hadith that was in Sahih al-Bukhari, where the Prophet ﷺ writes, Aslim Taslam. I found that to be a little bit weak. And I guess I wanted to know, like, can we say positively that Nizamuddin Awliya is getting this from the Hindu mystics? Or, I guess we could say it is reasonable to believe that if we see that it wasn't there before, like it wasn't there at all among Sufi, mystics before. And then afterwards, we see that Nizamuddin Awliya, specifically after his interaction with Hindu mysticism, then now he brings this.
You can also
forward.
add, I think,
That's
maybe
kind of
to that
the
sort of
the
a
point that I was trying to
post-Reformation thing that's going on, because after Shawrila Dahlawi's time, you see a lot of practices are kind of thrown out as being innovations. But I guess one of them, sort of like the breathing thing, it persists in some of the Sufi orders. It continues to persist, while other things are thrown out, like a lot of the music and things like that are removed.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was just giving it as one example. If one wanted to talk about clearer examples of Hindu Muslim syncretic religious practices, kind of maybe the clearer examples would be, for instance, Muslims maintaining caste. Muslims who are converting and maintaining caste rules would be would be one example. The situation where you will have, for instance, the blending of Islam and Hinduism in the poetry of Kabir, or in Sikhism, or in Ad-Din al-Ilahi. These would be other cases. These provide evidence that there is a type of blending, syncretic blending of these religious traditions that is going on, that is quite explicit in these cases. Now, the question is, okay, fine, many people will grant that when it comes to the poetry of Kabir, or if it comes to Ad-Din al-Ilahi, or if it comes to Sikhism. But they might say, okay, well, maybe the claim that you're making about the certain Chishti practices, maybe that is more debatable. That's fine. I mean, I was just thinking of it as a commonly cited example, but I wouldn't stake the entire, kind of this, the more general argument I'm making is that this is a context in which you do have some kind of blending between these religious traditions. Perhaps actually the breathing exercises it's mistaken, or there aren't strong methodological reasons to say that these practices somehow are tied to Hinduism. In fact, that might be a common scholarly mistake. One of the reasons why I'm bringing all of this up, though, is precisely if we want to understand the movements, the type of reform movements that characterize modern Islamic education in Indian context. Much of it is, many of the people involved are saying that the forms of religiosity that exist in the Indian subcontinent are problematic. Particularly, some of the Sufi practices are problematic in the sense that they are shaped by a type of Hindu-Muslim syncretism. And for that reason, the educational institutions and the religious ideas need to be reformed in order to reduce this kind of syncretic form of religiosity that has developed. So, I mean, that's kind of more of the idea, or that's kind of the more relevant point that I'm just trying to raise, at least in terms of talking about the modern evolution of Islamic education in a South Asian context. So,
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. I think we can continue on with the presentation. You were mentioning about, basically, you had gone to the point where, right after colonization occurs, post Shah Waliullah Dehlavi.
Yeah, so in terms of thinking about how South Asian Muslims react to the form of colonial modernity that is brought by the British, one can think of 5 movements. And each of these movements has a distinct understanding of the Islamic religion, and each of these movements establishes religious new educational institutions that are meant to propagate their understanding of the religion. So I'm going to talk about 5 of these movements. The first is the Aligarh movement. The second is the Ahl al-Hadith movement. The third is the Deobandi movement. The fourth is Nadwat al-Ulama movement. And the fifth is the Brailwi movement. So in terms of thinking about what differentiates these movements, I would like to recall some principles that have been discussed in the previous episodes. So in previous episodes, I've said in other regions, one of the things that distinguishes Islamic movements is the attitude of these movements towards the Islamic canon, and also their attitudes towards the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. So I'll just kind of recall this point because it's important for understanding these 5 movements that we find in the Indian subcontinent, although it really applies to movements across the entire Muslim world. So when we talk about the canon, what we're talking about is what are the authoritative sources of Islamic teachings. And here there are a number of different elements. So one is the Quran. We can say, okay, the Quran is one element of one source of authoritative Islamic, one authoritative source for determining Islamic teachings. Another is the Hadith reports. Another that some, but other people, and keep in mind, pretty much with the exception of the Quran, all of these are controversial in a South Asian context or modern South Asian context. So, yeah, everyone will accept that the Quran is an authoritative source of Islamic knowledge. But as we will see when it comes to Hadith reports, there are going to be differences between groups in South Asia where some groups will say, no, hadith are fabricated, or many hadith are fabricated. We don't consider them to be part of the Islamic canon. And this is then enshrined into their educational institutions. Another aspect of the Islamic canon is you have different doctrines that are accepted through taqleed. So these can be legal doctrines. So the four madhahib, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, they can be theological doctrines, meaning the different theological schools, Asharite, Maturidite, Ahlul Hadith. They can be different mystic doctrines of the different Sufi tariqas that are considered to be authoritative, like maybe Naqshbandi or Qadiriya. And these doctrines are accepted through taqleed. So some people will say, it's not only the Quran and Hadith which are authoritative sources of Islamic doctrine, but the fiqh rulings of the Maliki, or in a South Asian context, the fiqh rulings of the Hanafi madhab are also authoritative. Or the theological doctrines of the Maturidi school are also authoritative for us. Some Muslims consider these to be part of the canon. Other Muslims will challenge this and say, no, we don't follow any kind of taqleed. We don't consider these doctrines to be authoritative. Then, in addition, so you have certain early widespread theological, legal, and mystical doctrines that are accepted through taqleed. And then in addition to that, you also have some later doctrines and some controversial doctrines that are maybe associated with Sufism and syncretism. So maybe you'll have kind of a notion of the Muhammadan light. Maybe you'll have some notion of maybe a practice of istighatha. Maybe you'll have the notion that musical instruments can be used in Sufi rituals. So those are kind of more controversial and often later Islamic doctrines that for some Muslim groups are canonical. The fact that these practices exist indicates that they should be accepted. And then other groups will say, no, those aren't part of the Islamic canon. Writings that endorse these doctrines aren't part of the Islamic canon. In fact, the canon should be purged of these doctrines. So when we're trying to compare the different movements like Aligar and Ahlul Hadith and Nadwatul Ulama, they take different stances on what are the sources, what exactly are the sources of authoritative Islamic teachings that are part of the canon. Then beyond that, you also have these different movements in South Asia differing over their attitude towards the liberal ideal of civilizational progress and science and human rights. You have some groups that are quite willing to reinterpret or reject Islamic doctrines that conflict with scientific findings and human rights ideals. And then you have other groups that are much more resistant to that. And this is something that is kind of influencing how these different movements approach the interpretation of the Quran or the Hadith reports or something. So, for instance, you might have two groups that can agree that the Quran or that Hadith reports are part of the Islamic canon, that they're that they are a source of authoritative Islamic teachings, but at the same time, maybe one of these groups is really inclined towards the liberal ideal of civilizational progress, and they might see a teaching that is found in the Quran and Hadith reports, like, let's say, polygamy. and they might say, okay, well, we maybe because they're inclined towards a liberal ideal of civilizational progress, they might say things like, okay, polygamy was appropriate because for past times, maybe because a lot of people were getting killed in warfare. There were lots of women who didn't have husbands, so it made sense then, but it's not like a permanent ruling. Or you might have someone say, yeah, of course, the Quran is mentioning things like a jinn, the Quran and the Hadith reports, or the Asharite or Maturidite texts, theological texts are mentioning the existence of jinn. But jinn in this sense is meant as kind of like a metaphor. Jinn or shaitan is meant as a metaphor for, let's say, evil. So to say that someone is possessed by a jinn or possessed by shaitan means that they're kind of under that evil aspects of their character are kind of exercising influence for them. So groups that are more inclined towards the liberal ideal of civilizational progress and its scientific worldview are going to be more uncomfortable with teachings that are supernatural and that talk about jinn or angels, or God created humankind from created a first man from clay, and so on. So this is what is going to differentiate these different movements. So let's begin. The first movement that we should talk about is the Aligarh movement. And the roots of the Aligarh movement are tied to earlier British efforts to reform Islam by reforming Islamic education. So the first British institution that is established that is concerned with Islamic education is known as the Alia Madrasa in Calcutta, which is established in 1782. And this madrasa is an official government madrasa that offers training in Arabic, Persian, and Islamic law. And one of the reasons why the British are offering this kind of training is that they want people who have a mastery of these disciplines that can work for the British government, because one of the things that the British government is doing at this time is, to some extent, they're imposing British law, but to some extent they are they've also promised the Hindus and they've promised the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent that they're also going to administer and preserve, to some extent, Muslim law and Hindu law. So for that reason, they need officials, they need government officials with some kind of background in these things. However, what?
I just want to kick in here. Just one small thing. So the Aligarh University, it originally actually used to be called the Anglo Mohammedan Oriental College. So it wasn't right away known as the Aligarh University. My understanding is that that didn't age very well, right? Obviously, because you had the word Anglo and then Mohammedan, and then you had also the word Oriental, which also kind of became unpopular. So it was renamed to Aligarh University. I think it's worth knowing basically some of the naming history to kind of understand what purpose it served. There's a small difference also that I want to mention about the what you have on the slide there about the 1782 Alia Madrasa that was established in Calcutta. My understanding is that the Calcutta Madrasa, this was different than the Aligarh movement or university in general. I believe the Aligarh University was established later, before the Alia Madrasa in Calcutta. And the Alia Madrasa in Calcutta was actually, in my understanding, much more directly tied to the British government, where it was directly funded and managed actually by colonial administrators, as opposed to the Aligarh Madrasa, the Aligarh, or I guess the Anglo Mohammedan Oriental College was established by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who was definitely very influenced by the British, was knighted by the British, and was also on British payroll. But maybe not the college itself was not directly administered by the British themselves.
Yeah, those are good points. I would just say, I'll try and bring everything. You bring up some really important points, and I think if we go through the next couple of slides, it'll enable me to present kind of a more clear picture of how these things fit together. Oftentimes, when people think of Anglo-Mohammedan Oriental College, they're not really clear about the precursor institutions like the Alia Madrasa or Hugli College. So it's just kind of a way to build up. I'm not claiming that Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College is the same as Alia Madrasa or Hugli College. I'm just kind of trying to give the precedence of these British efforts. And you are correct that in terms of Alia Madrasa and Hugli College, these institutions are more directly run by the British. Whereas if you talk about Aligarh, or we talk about Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental University, yes, the people who are really spearheading that are more like Syed Ahmed Khan. And yes, there are financial contributions and aid for the British, but there also is a greater degree of autonomy for this institution. So it's not kind of just directly run by the government in the same way as these earlier precursors are.
And I have a question for you. Like, is it your understanding that, like, the Aligarh movement, like, if we were to dissect, if we were to separate the college from the movement, right? Would you say that the Alia Madrasa and the Hugli College, they are part of the Aligarh movement in general, or would you classify the Aligarh movement? Because my conception was, I guess, that I do see the parallels that you would be making if that were your position. But my understanding was that the Aligarh movement slash madrasa is kind of spearheaded by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, who comes like slightly later than the Alia Madrasa, which might have been like kind of separate project. But would you?
Yeah, I would say they're
Put them
important
together?
for understanding the
Your
genealogy of Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, but they are earlier project. They're an earlier version of the British project to reform Islamic education. But I would agree with you that the Aligarh movement is like a post, Sepoy mutiny project. That is a late 19th century project, as opposed to late 19th century project as opposed to early 19th century project, which is kind of what we're talking about right now. Put aside Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College just for the moment. So right now we're just talking about precursors, which technically speaking are not part of the Aligarh movement. All we're trying to establish at this point is that through Alia Madrasa and Hugli College, so Alia Madrasa is established in 1782, Hugli College is established in 1836. By the early 19th century, so by the 1820s, both of these, or by 1820s, 1830s, both of these institutions are mixing Arabic Islamic education with the teaching of English and modern Western forms of knowledge that are linked to science, and that also forms of knowledge that are linked to visions of society and politics and the notion of civilizational progress. So people who go to Alia Madrasa and Hugli College in the early 19th century are, on the one hand, getting access to, they're studying Arabic, they're studying the Arabic tradition, they're studying the Islamic tradition. On the other hand, they are also getting exposure to the English language and modern Western forms of knowledge and associated kind of political messaging on the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. And what this usually produces in South Asia, as in other regions, are graduates who kind of bring these ideas together, synthesize these ideas together, and thereby produce a type of hybrid thinking where the Arabic Islamic tradition is there. But there's also an understanding of that Arabic Islamic tradition that is shaped, that is more sympathetic to liberal ideals of science and human rights. So after Alia Madrasa and Hugli College, then you get the Aligarh movement. The Aligarh movement doesn't come later on, until later on. It doesn't emerge until the 1870s. The people who are associated with this Aligarh movement are strongly pro-British. They're quite explicit in their desire to use education as a means of generating a reformed Islam that combines the Islamic tradition with the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. Leading figures include Sayyid Ahmed Khan, also Chirag Ali, also Amir Ali. So these figures are all kind of involved. They
I want to pick your brain a little bit here. What, I guess, explicit mentions have you found where the colonial administrators are interested in educational reform? Like, I know there's the
well, I mean,
Macaulay
you
Minute.
have
Do you have other
people, for
examples in mind?
instance, going ahead. I mean, if you wanted to talk a little about, I mean, I would need to look at the sources so that they're all fresh in my head. You'll get Lord Cromer talking about how, you know, he wants to achieve in India. So he's speaking maybe in the early 20th century. He says, you know, we want to repeat educational reform at Al Azhar. So Lord Cromer was working in India before he came to Egypt. And he basically is saying in the early 20th century that, what we were doing in the late 19th century in India with Syed Ahmed Khan in reforming education, that's also what we need to do here. There's also, I actually wrote an article on this topic where all the sources were kind of in mind, and it was talking about the different British figures who were kind of quotes from them and how they're trying to encourage the reform of Islamic education as a way of reforming the Islamic religion. It is an article that is published in the journal Arabica. So if you just search my name and then search the journal Arabica, it has the quotes there from the different people involved.
Thank you so much. I actually learned something new today, that Cromer was actually in India before Egypt. My understanding, I always thought that he was just in Egypt. I wasn't too aware of his involvement in South Asia, but it makes a lot of sense. I guess his ideas progressed as he moved on. I know Curzon was there. Lord Curzon was in the Indian subcontinent, or I think he had some major play also in the Alia Madrasa itself as well.
Yeah, I mean, the
But I wasn't aware
policies,
actually that Cromer was there as
this
well.
goes back to a point that I was trying to emphasize earlier. The South Asia is really at the forefront of Islamic educational reform and colonial efforts to reform Islamic education. So really, South Asia is like the first project. South Asia is the first experience. And then they take what they learned from South Asia to the Middle East, in particular Egypt. And then after they're done with Egypt, then they start exporting that model to other areas like sub-Saharan parts of Africa, whether it is Sudan, whether it is to Nigeria, whether it is to Malaysia. So there is this kind of genealogy of British educational reform that may be on the extreme end of things, starts with Alia Madrasa and Hooghly College, and then Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. Okay, then the reform of Al-Azhar, then, you know, Katsina College in Nigeria or Gordon College in Sudan. It's just kind of, these are later institutions, but there's kind of this relationship between them. And they also have similar administrators who are talking about how what they're doing in one region, they're also going to go ahead and take and use in other regions of the British Empire. So, getting back to this, okay, so you have the British, they are not directly running they're not directly running Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later comes to be known as Aligarh Muslim University, but they are sponsoring it. They are providing funding to it. And this is actually important for the story of certain other movements that we find in a South Asian context, like the Deobandi movement and Nadwatul Ulama, because one of the things that these other movements will do is they say we need to come up with some way of funding our educational institutions that doesn't involve the government, because basically the British government is using its funding to shape the curriculum, to try and reshape the Islamic tradition in a way that accords with their ideals, maybe rather than the authentic ideals of Islam. So when you look at the Deobandis, when you look at Nadwatul Ulama, they themselves are aware of this British history of using funding with Alia Madrasa and Hooghly College and Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College. They're familiar with how the British use funding to shape a curriculum, whether they're directly running the university or whether they're not directly running the university, but simply contributing financially to the university. So this is actually a pretty important aspect of understanding the structure of religious institutions in a South Asian context. And it actually leads to this kind of opposite reaction. The Deobandis in particular are so critical of what the British are doing that they really form these type of institutions that are maximally independent or designed to be maximally independent of any kind of government interference. And this is one of the reasons why, if you were to compare Deobandi institutions to institutions that are found in other parts of the Muslim world, the Deobandi institutions are among the most independent of the government. I don't want to exaggerate it and say, oh, they're completely independent of the government. I mean, obviously, governments through funding, through laws, can always exert significant amounts of power over institutions and individuals associated with these institutions. But if you were to compare them to the Arab religious universities in Egypt and Saudi and Morocco, the Turkish institutions, the Indonesian institutions, these other religious institutions are much more directly integrated with the government. They have kind of a lesser degree of independence because of how they're structured. And for that reason, they are more easily influenced by these governments than the kind of Deobandi model that develops in reaction to Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. But at any rate, if we want to understand the reaction, we have to get a sense of, what is going on at Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. So Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, it's established in India. It has a particular notion of the Islamic canon. So they are people who are part of the Aligarh movement, who are part of this institution, say, okay, yeah, of course, the Quran is the source of Islamic teachings. But they are willing to outright reject a significant number of hadith. And within the Aligarh movement, there are certain people who come pretty close to a type of Quranism. So, you read some of Syed Ahmed Khan's work, or Chirag Ali's works in particular. I don't want to say that they're like full-blown Quranists, although you do have, since in the late 19th century, you do have a formal Quranist movement in South Asia, run by figures like, I think, Abdullah Chakralawi, and so on. But you have within the Aligarh movement people who are quite open to rejecting most of the hadith corpus and saying, no, it's not part of the canon of Islam. Beyond that, they fully reject kind of the notion that the traditional madhabs or the theological schools, that taqlid of the doctrine of these legal and theological schools is in any way binding on them. They say that's not part of Islam that we're going to follow. They also are critical of later and more controversial doctrines and practices that are associated with Sufism and that are associated with kind of Hindu Islamic syncretism. So they eliminate all of these from the canon. The canon for
Okay, quick question for you. Okay, so their Quranism, the Aligarh movement and their Quranism, is it a methodological Quranism? Like, there's two ways of doing this, right? One is that you from scratch you build an argument for Quranism, because you genuinely don't believe let's say about the preservation or authenticity of hadith, and you make an argument for it. That's one way. And the other one is like a post hoc explanation, right? Like, which is basically that, okay, these are some conclusions we want to reach to. Like, we don't want to, for example, believe in the Dajjal, and his powers. And we don't want to believe in, let's say, something called the jinn or something called the angels. And so what will we do? The easiest way to do that is to cut out hadith, because that's where a lot of details are mentioned, and leave maybe the Quran, which is to some degree, open to our interpretation. And so kind of adopting it that way. So which one would you say, I'm trying to understand, like for the Aligarh movement, is it from, I guess, is it bottom up, or is it top down? Is it like methodological
Both.
Quranism,
So
or
it's
is it like
methodological
post hoc?
Quranism in the sense that this is called Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. One of the aspects of, so once again, I want to be clear that they're approaching Quranism in the sense that they're rejecting many hadith. There's like widespread hadith rejection, but it's not like the formal, like full, Chakralawi type Quranism. But the reason why they're moving in this direction, one of the methodological reasons, is they're greatly influenced by Orientalist scholarship. So even though Syed Ahmed Khan is critical of Orientalist scholarship in some ways, he's appreciative of it in other ways, and incorporates their findings into the curriculum of Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. So they're incorporating Orientalist scholarship, which is saying that there are methodological reasons to doubt many of the hadith, that many of the chains maybe can't be traced back beyond the tabi'in or the atba tabi'in. So there's kind of these type of arguments. There's that methodological issue. On the other hand, the Aligarh movement is also like a moral political movement. I mean, they also find many of the doctrines that are found in the hadith to be objectionable because they're seen as non-scientific or conflicting with liberal norms. So this is an addition. They're looking for any reason to reject hadith of this sort to begin with. And they will quite explicitly say things like, if a hadith conflicts with reason, that's a reason that's a justification for rejecting it. And reason for them is like a liberal version of reason, which is scientific in outlook and kind of committed to liberal human rights norms. Moreover, it's worth pointing out, I mean, this is also easy to see in the way that they're going about interpretation. So yeah, they will get rid of certain hadith, but they will also say, even if we have to accept so they can get rid of hadith, it's harder for them. They can't get rid of the Quranic text, though. So they would say, but even when it comes to clear statements in the Quranic text on things like, let's say, jihad warfare, slavery, polygamy, they don't say, oh yeah, the Quranic text can securely be dated, therefore we accept these practices. No, they say, look, the jihad mentioned in the Quran is defensive jihad, not offensive jihad. Or when it comes to polygamy, it's because of the conditions of the time. Or when it comes to God creating Adam from clay, or creating Adam with his hand. Okay, this is a metaphor for Darwinian evolution. So the creationist ideas that you would find in the Quran, the Quran and Hadith, but or just the Quran alone, they would go ahead and interpret them in metaphorical ways. Or references to shaitan and the jinn are references to the human impulse to evil that is found in people's hearts. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to think about a parallel from early Islamic history, you can think about the Mu'tazilites. So when you talk about, 8th and 9th century Mu'tazilite figures, they have a particular understanding of God. They have an idea of God as kind of like an entity that is radically unlike human beings, to the point where maybe you would say he doesn't have, if the Quran is mentioning that God has hands or a face or speaks or is located in an upwards direction, you would have Mu'tazilites have two approaches to statements of this type. So one is, if statements of this type are found in the Hadith, then you question the authenticity of the Hadith. And if they're found in the Quran, then you would produce a type of interpretation of the Quran through ta'wil, in order to remove the apparent dissimilarity between the Mu'tazilite conception of God, who is like kind of an invisible, incorporeal spirit, and some of the language that is used in the Quran. So here you have a similar issue emerging, except the issue is not so much a way, it's not so much like a Neoplatonic or Mu'tazilite theology justifying or providing a reason, providing a motivation for Hadith rejection. In this case, it's more like a liberal ideology providing a motivation for Hadith rejection. So the Aligarh movement, they have kind of a more minimalistic version of the Islamic canon. They reject a lot of Hadith texts that seem to conflict with this liberal ideology. And then even those Hadith texts that they accept, or the Quranic verses that they accept, when there is a contradiction with liberal norms, they are quite willing to provide new radical reinterpretations of these texts, rendering them more consistent with liberal ideals. So this is kind of like the Aligarh movement. This is in their curriculum. This is taught at their university, and this generates opposition from these other movements that say, this is problematic. The Aligarh movement is basically producing a version of Islam that is too influenced by Western norms or modern Western ideologies. In particular, Deobandis and Ahlul Hadith are very critical of the Aligarh movement. Now we come to the second movement, which is the Ahlul Hadith movement. This is a movement that emerges around the mid-19th century. Some of the early figures involved are Syed Ahmed Shahid and Syed Nadir Hussain and Siddiq Hassan Khan. The Ahlul Hadith, in terms of their version of the Islamic canon, they, of course, adopt the Quranic text as an authoritative source of Islamic teachings. And beyond this, they accept the traditional corpus of Hadith reports. So basically, if you have a Hadith, even if we're talking about Ahad Hadiths, as long as these Hadiths have a chain which is Sahih or Hasan, they are going to accept it. What they do reject as part of the canon is they say these legal and theological and Sufi doctrines that have been adopted through taqlid, no, we don't reject, we don't accept taqlid. Our version of Islam is simply based on the Quran and Hadith. And the Ahlul Hadith are very, very critical of what they see as non-orthodox forms of Sufism and syncretic forms of religiosity, kind of Islamic Hindu syncretic forms of religiosity that are associated with some Sufi communities. Also, the Ahlul Hadith have quite a critical attitude towards the liberal ideal of civilizational progress. So for that reason, for the Ahlul Hadith, if they find a teaching in the Quran that is, polygamy or jihad or the existence of jinn, this doesn't trouble them. They don't say, oh, this conflicts with science and liberal human rights ideals. Maybe we should engage in some kind of reinterpretation, some kind of ta'wil of the text. No, they are generally quite inclined towards scriptural literalism when it comes to interpretation. And they're comfortable and, in fact, proud of maintaining Islamic doctrines, even those doctrines that conflict with Islamic, with liberal Western sensibilities. So they see this as, preserving, even though it's difficult, kind of preserving authentic Islamic teachings. Interestingly, since the mid 20th century, the Ahlul Hadith kind of merges, combines with the Wahhabi Salafi movement that is centered in Saudi Arabia, in part because in the middle of the 20th century, or the 60s or the 70s, the Saudi government starts providing increased funding for Ahl Hadith educational institutions and organizations. Although there is kind of a difference between, it should be emphasized that there is kind of a difference between the Ahl Hadith and the Wahhabis. Traditionally, the Wahhabis would engage in before the 1950s, and especially before the 1920s. The Wahhabis were known for engaging in kind of like a mass takfir of other Muslims on the grounds that they were engaging in shirk. And when the Wahhabis would fight jihads, these would be kind of targeting other peoples who claimed to be Muslims, including the Ottoman Empire. The Ahlul Hadith aren't involved in this. So yeah, the Ahlul Hadith can agree that, we are scriptural literalists and we really want to strictly stick to the Quran and Hadith. But the Ahlul Hadith are kind of known for fighting non-Muslims. So they're known for, having a hostile attitude towards the British. They're known for having kind of a hostile attitude towards maybe Hindu India. But in terms, then this would kind of be like a difference between them and the kind of Wahhabism. But Wahhabism itself develops over the course of the 20th century. And then the mid 20th century, these movements will start blending together. The number of Ahlul Hadith in educational institutions in South Asia is, there are a significant number of institutions, but their overall number is less than the number of institutions that you would find with some of the other movements, in particular the Deobandi and the Brailwi movement. So kind of, if you were to look at Islamic educational institutions that are affiliated with movements in the Indian subcontinent, kind of Deobandis have the most. Then after that, Brailvis, and then only after that would you find the Ahlul Hadith. If we're talking about the most important institutions of higher religious education in Ahlul Hadith, or religious education in the Indian subcontinent, one of them is Jamia Salafia in Faisalabad, Pakistan, which was established in 1955. Another is Jamia Salafia, which is established in 1953, and it's affiliated with Saudi universities, in particular Medina University and Al-Qura University. Also in India, you have an important Ahl Hadith institution called Jamia Salafia, which is located in Varanasi, and that's established in 1966. And this is once again a institution that has received significant funding from Saudi Arabia. So this is part of this merging between the Ahlul Hadith and the kind of Wahhabi Salafi movements. That brings us to the Deobandi movement. So the Deobandi movement emerges in the middle of the 19th century, slightly later than Ahl Hadith. It is founded by Muhammad Qasim Nenantawi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing these names. Maybe Mufti Tufail can help me with a more accurate pronunciation. But at least, in terms of how they appear to be written, I would say Nenantawi and Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. They established The first institution, the first Deobandi institution is known as Darul Uloom Deoband. This is located in the city of Deoband in northern India. It's established in 1866. Okay, so I'm being told that the way to pronounce this, that proper way to pronounce this is Muhammad Qasim Nanatwi. Nanatwi. Okay, so I hope that's a little bit closer to the proper way of saying things. Deobandi institutions are interesting because they are really shaped by the legacy of Shah Waliullah, and also certain institutions that were very important in the Indian subcontinent on the eve of modernity, like Delhi's Madrasa Rahimiyya and Lucknow's Farangi Mahal. One of the interesting features, significant features that I mentioned earlier about the Deoband model, about this first, Darul Uloom Deoband that is established, is the people who are founding it are critical of what's happening with Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. They say, we do not want government funding. Instead, we just need to raise funds from kind of students and do fundraising from the local community. But unfortunately, we are not going to be able to depend on the government because the government is going to use its funding to try and influence the curriculum. Someone might, of course, say, well, okay, why not just depend on waqfs? One problem that you have in the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere is that many of the waqfs are also taken over by the government. So in the pre-modern period, you have Islamic educational institutions that are dependent on these waqf endowments. But in the modern period, whether we're talking about Egypt or India or Turkey, the waqf endowments are taken over by colonial governments or colonial type government. So there's kind of a shift away from waqf dependence and greater dependence on kind of smaller fundraising from the local community.
Sorry, I think you put me on stage a little bit late. I was actually about the name Nanotwi. I just kind of typed it in. That's fine. You can carry on. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. See if I can get this slide back up again. Yeah, so they are going to collect smaller donations from local Muslim communities, and they, in these institutions, you have a particular notion of what the proper Islamic canon is. So like the Ahlul Hadith and other groups, yeah, they're going to accept the Quran. They're also going to accept Hadith reports. But one of the ways that they differ from the Ahlul Hadith is they are going to acknowledge the importance of taqleed. And for that reason, they consider the pre-modern legal schools and theological schools and writings of the important, sober Sufi tariqas to be authoritative sources of Islamic teaching. So they're committed to, they're kind of consider themselves to be bound, not only by Quran and Hadith, like the Ahlul Hadith, but also by Quran and Hadith plus Hanafi legal doctrine, plus a kind of sober Sharia compliant forms of Sufism. These are texts that are going to be endorsed by them and considered to be parts of the Islamic canon. On the other hand, you do have them being critical of certain elements of religious practice that developed later in Islamic history, or that reject, or that seem to exemplify a type of Hindu Islamic syncretism. And this is going to lead to divergence or some tensions that you find between the Deobandi movement and the Barelvi movement that we will talk about in a moment. One of the other things that is important about the Deobandi movement is, like the Ahlul Hadith, they have kind of a critical attitude towards liberal notions of civilizational progress. So they are not inclined to interpret or reinterpret the Quran or other Islamic texts to produce a version of the Islamic religion that is more in line with the liberal ideals. One of the things that is a very important about the Deobandis is they kind of are able to run they're able to create the largest network of Islamic educational institutions modeled on Darul Uloom Deoband, but that are found, throughout India, throughout Pakistan, throughout Afghanistan. So in the Indian subcontinent, the Deobandis have the highest number of higher educational institutions, and then kind of the Brailvis come second, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the Ahl al-Hadith come after that. So in India, some of the more important institutions would be Darul Uloom Deoband, established in 1866, Madahir al-Ulum in Saharanpur, established in 1866. In Pakistan, Darul Uloom Karachi, established in 1951. Darul Uloom Islamia Benoria Town, established in 1954. Darul Uloom Haqqaniya, established in 1947. In Bangladesh, what, please?
Yeah, so sorry, was just a couple of things. Before, basically, I was thinking, a little deeper on this. Would you say that the Deobandi movement was particular about its adherence to the Quran and Sunnah along with the Hanafi legal code? My understanding is that it could be any of the four madhahib, right? It could be any of the four madhabs, not only particularly the Hanafi legal code. Of course, because this is all happening in South Asia, and especially northern India is mostly, you can say, adherence of the Hanafi legal code. So that's kind of where their adherence, I guess, comes up. But we do find plenty of examples, especially, for example, in South Africa or even in India itself. If you go to South India, you'll get sister Deobandi institutes that are, Shafi'i based, or they have parallel tracks for, Hanafi or Shafi'i students, or, Maliki students, and so on and so forth. So I think what describes them is more particular to the idea of taqleed, where it belongs. The reason why I want to caveat that and nuance that a little bit more as well is because you do find also, for example, certain shuyukh that are Deobandi but will step out of taqleed for certain masail, or they will maybe not adhere to taqleed in the way that we would understand, for a general layman. However, those would be kind of exceptional cases in the sense that they're not feeding into any kind of colonial or post-colonial narrative. It's kind of independent on its own. Like the particular example I'm thinking of is Sheikh Yunus, right? Sheikh Yunus Jaunpuri, or even his teacher, Sheikh Zakaria, for example, Kandlawi. You will see that there are particular masail where, they will not go necessarily with the Hanafi school. This is something that is also taken from Shah Waliullah himself, right? You also find Yusuf Banuri. You mentioned Banuri town as one.
In fact, there's an area in northern Pakistan where you find
the sister
a large
institute.
number of Deobandis that are actually more like Ahl Hadith leaning as well. So you have that dynamic that also exists. Yeah,
That's an interesting mix. I would want to understand that more. But the point I was making is, I think it's more about adherence to a legal school for the overwhelming majority of people, in the sense that if you do not have that independent juristic ability for ijtihad, then you stick by taqleed. That's kind of the norm that they would choose. But I guess my pushback is more on, is it particular to Hanafism, or is it, just adherence to
Yeah, I mean, I can usually, obviously, when I think of Deobandis, I just think of the Hanafi majority, but it's good. I mean, these are some these are some details that are significant that I was less aware of. I wasn't clear, to what extent that you have Deobandis open to other schools. I thought maybe somewhat openness to Shafism, and understand that Deobandis are kind of respectful of all four legal schools, but in terms of seeing Deobandis who aren't Hanafi or maybe Shafi, I haven't seen many of them. I also wasn't aware of like the Deobandi mixture
So
of
right
kind
in
of
Indonesia,
Deobandis and
actually, you will
Ahlul Hadith.
Yeah, there was
that one I
for
got to hear more
example,
about too. But
in northern areas of Pakistan, there was Allama Panjpir, and people like them, they actually followed the same line through Shawla Dehlawi, and had I believe they were pretty much Deobandi in a lot of things, but in some points of Aqidah, they were actually lean more to Ibn Taymiyyah. Obviously, they would have a big clash between them and the traditional Deobandi. There was always this tension that existed. But
so actually, okay, so this actually prompts some questions, I guess, because the notion of Ahl Hadith is more of the fiqhi one, right? Is it Aqidah one? Aqidah one, yes, it does come jumbled sometimes with Aqidah points, but generally, a lot of times they'll just say, "Oh, we follow Imam Ahmad, or we follow, Ibn Taymiyyah, or something like that." You do find, like, even modern day, you find like Maulana Manzoor Mingal, for example, he will
yeah,
adhere
it's
to
always
certain
particular issues. It's not
ideas
an
that
acceptance of a whole
he
thing.
will lean more towards Hadith. Exactly. So I think the general, like, if we had to make a general principle, the idea would be general legal conformism, general theological conformism, except for people that are like able to do so. The point that Maulana Sadullah, you mentioned about Shah Waliullah, everyone traces themselves back to Shah Waliullah,
Right.
including the Ahl Hadith and the Deobandis and the Barelvis, everybody.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can.
I
Trace
mean,
themselves back to Shah Waliullah.
it's been a little. I know that this is always kind of like a debated issue, and also my understanding is that certain claims have been made about alterations of Shah Waliullah's text. So maybe there are some texts where it appears that he's, being very critical of istighatha, for instance, and then Braillevis will say like this text has been tampered with. My own understanding is that he seems to me to be closest to the Deobandis, but I know that he's claimed by all of the different movements.
And just on the point of like fiqh, even like in a lot of Deobandi madrasas, like for example, in South Africa, you'll find students that are there from like Tunisia. They're Malikis from Tunisia.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to mention this to Dr. Aria. Right there in Indonesia, actually, you have sister Deobandi institutes that are full-fledged
In
Shafi'i,
Cape
like
Town, yeah.
no other, in Cape Town as well. If you go to, yeah, it's straight up just Shafi'i. Like there's no Hanafi fiqh whatsoever in it. In Johannesburg, you find a good mix. Like you find madrasas that will actually have like parallel tracks for Shafi'i students and Hanafi students, because there's a large population that come from like the Philippines, from Indonesia, Malaysia, Mozambique, a lot of the Southern African countries in which the Shafi'i school is prevalent. So I think it has to do more with legal conformism and theological conformism, and the idea is that, like, obviously whichever way majority goes, that's what the school will adhere to. It so happened that northern India was mostly Hanafis, so that's kind of in terms of legal.
It might
That's
even be
really
reflective.
helpful.
So that's kind of what they went with over there.
I'm saying it might even be reflective of sort of the larger ummah, because the makeup of like percentage of Hanafis to Shafis, then to Malikis, and to Hanbalis. it kind of might be reflective of that also. You find that same sort of, yeah, but prime being Deoband being within central centered right there within like the Hanafi area of India, and kind of surrounded by Hanafis. I guess that's where it took that sort of identity.
Yeah. So so
But
I guess in light of your comments, so what I would agree with you. This is a compelling points that you have made. So I would say that in terms of the Islamic canon, they are, concerned with, not just affirming the authority of Quran and Hadith, but also the traditional legal and theological schools. And in Indian context, just because the population is Hanafi, that it tends to be more Hanafi. But if we take into account global, kind of a global reach of these institutions, we can see that they are in other contexts with other populations that are maybe Shafi or from some other legal or theological school. They might be represented within the system as well. So these are some very useful comments. Okay, then the next movement that I was going to mention is Nadwat al-Ulama. So within South Asia, some religious scholars agreed with the Aligarh movement that Muslims should accept some significant measure of civilizational progress, so in terms of science and in terms of liberal human rights norms. However, they thought that the Aligarh movement went too far in this direction because, once again, the Aligarh movement, they are willing to reject in a sweeping fashion much or even most of the Hadith corpus. They are also willing to really kind of cast aside basic elements of Islamic aqidah or basic theological doctrines, maybe on the existence of jinn, maybe on the performance of various miracles, maybe on creationism. And another criticism of the Aligarh movement is that it's not doesn't have a critical enough attitude towards liberal Western modernity. So if we're just thinking about the Deobandi movement and the Ahl al-Hadith movement, these are quite strict and quite conservative Islamic movements. In fact, they go beyond the type of patterns that we see in much of the Arab world. So maybe someone might imagine that if we're thinking of, very forms of Islam that are very critical of liberal modernity, we're going to find them in the Middle East, if not in Turkey, then in the Arab world. But the type of religiosity that you find in the Arab world, so yeah, I would grant that if you talk about maybe Wahhabi Salafism, yes. But the type of religiosity that you find kind of dominant within the Arab world is kind of like Azharite, Wasatiyya type Islam, which on the one hand, which is, it does affirm the Quran, it does affirm the majority of hadith reports, but is willing to dispense with taqlid. And then even when it comes to interpreting the Quran and interpreting the hadith reports, they will say, we're going to be pretty literalistic in matters of ritual and marriage and family law, but much of the other parts of the religion, like other areas of fiqh, we can be flexible. We could get rid of Islamic law, criminal law. We could get rid of the apostasy punishments. We could get rid of these various rules in the name of maslahah. So Nadwat al-Ulama is maybe a bit similar to these type of Azhar type, Wasatiyya type of movement. And the most important figure in the Nadwat al-Ulama movement is Shibli Nu'mani, who is an individual who lived 1857 to 1954. Or I'm sorry, 1857 to 1914. He is a traditionally trained Islamic scholar. He does work in the initial part of his career, he works for Aligarh Muslim University, but at the same time, he's critical because he thinks maybe it's too open to liberal modernity. And then he decides to establish a new institution that is maybe, in terms of its outlook, somewhere between Aligarh or Anglo-Mohammedan Oriental University and between Deoband. So this is Darul Uloom, Nadwat al-Ulama. And one of the things that you find is that the kind of outlook, so Shibli Nu'mani is friendly with Rashid Rida, and he has kind of, to a certain extent, a type, similar type openness to Wasatiyya, Azharite type ideology. He is also kind of building relations with the type of Arab religious movements or religious universities that you find across the Middle East. One of the things that you find in Nadwat al-Ulama is that they don't only teach traditional Islamic forms of knowledge, as is common in the Deobandi institutions, but they also teach English and modern Western forms of knowledge. And they also have a bit of an ecumenical approach in the sense that they say Muslims from different backgrounds can study here. So if you come from a Ahlul Hadith background or a Deobandi background or Brailwi background, you can study at our institution. So the first Nadwat al-Ulama, or Darul Uloom Nadwat al-Ulama, their first educational institution is established in 1894 in the city of Lucknow. But then over time, you have other institutions that are based on the same model that are found across India and sometimes outside, and some outside of India as well, in places like Bangladesh. Initially, Nadwat al-Ulama received some support from the British colonial government, but by 1920, it consciously reversed its position. It was worried about, too much government interference or influence, so they decided to follow the Deobandi policy of kind of principled refusal of government funding. So generally speaking, Nadwa institutions like Deobandi institutions rely primarily on private donations. During the life of Shibli Nomani, Nadwat al-Ulama had kind of more of an orientation towards an Azharite, Middle Eastern, Abdu Rida type, Wasatiyya type ideology. But over time, it becomes more and more influenced by Deobandis. So a lot of the scholars who are talking about Nadwat al-Ulama today would say basically since Shibli Nomani passed away in 1914, Nadwat al-Ulama institutions have evolved to be closer to Deobandi institutions, although comparatively speaking, they are somewhat more open to Western liberal forms of knowledge. They're less committed to taqlid, and those would be some of the ways that you would differentiate them. Now, the last movement that we have to address is the Brailwi movement, also known as Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat. This was founded in the 1880s by Ahmed Raza Khan Brailwi. So the Brailwis, in terms of their perspective on the Islamic canon, they're going to say we endorse the Quran, we endorse the traditional corpus of Hadith reports. We are going to endorse, taqlid in terms of the traditional legal schools and the theological schools. Well, beyond that, we are going to endorse the authority of some later writings that contain controversial Sufi doctrines, and we're also going to maintain a level of openness to certain practices that arguably reflect kind of a type of syncretic Hindu influences. So some of the things that you find among Brailwi movement, broadly understood, would be an openness to Indian Sufi devotional music, or Qawwali, which arguably is patterned to some extent on, has certain Hindu influences. You would say that Brailwis are very much also oriented by this notion of extensive veneration of the dead, including making regular pilgrimage to tombs or dawahs, and asking the dead for their intercession, and also holding elaborate annual festivals to mark the deaths of these saints in a kind of a ceremony known as Urs. In particular, one ceremony that is especially influenced is that which commemorates the death of the founder of the Chishti order, who is Mu'in ad-Din Chishti. In terms of one of the other features that you really find among the Brailwis is they very much emphasize the importance of a loving reverence for Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they are, in terms of the amount of respect that they grant to the Prophet, this is tied to the notion that he should be elevated in the sense of possessing a type of supernatural status. So in practice, they will express this love in annual Mawlid celebrations to commemorate the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where people will sing praise poetry and describe events throughout his life. And those aspects actually, in terms of simply having a Mawlid celebration, this isn't necessarily so controversial. But there will be other aspects in the Braille version of the Mawlid. There will be certain practices that reflect controversial later beliefs that developed in Muslim communities and that are endorsed by Braillis but are seen as problematic by other groups like Deobandis and Ahlul Hadith. So one of the features of Brailli Mawlid celebrations is people standing up, is the belief that the Prophet ﷺ is physically present, that the dead Prophet ﷺ is somehow physically present at these different Mawlid celebrations, and in the course of these celebrations, they will stand up. They will stand up to greet him. You also have I'm sorry, my slide presentation is maybe a little bit. Then you'll also have that they will defend a doctrine of An-Nur al-Muhammadi, which asserts that God's first creation was the Prophet ﷺ, who initially existed in a form of light. And you have some Brailvis go further, saying that the Prophet, that God has given the Prophet ﷺ a type of control or tasarruf over the entire universe, so that the Prophet ﷺ can with albeit with power given to him by God, but he can accomplish anything that he wants to accomplish. And this is tied to their notion that people should, through tawassul and istighatha, ask for things from the Prophet ﷺ, which he's capable of delivering. So, you're sick, if you need a child, it would be legitimate for you to go to the grave of a dead saint or to ask the Prophet ﷺ for some kind of assistance. And there's also this idea that the Prophet ﷺ has detailed knowledge given to him by God of all past and future things that will occur in the universe. Now, many of these beliefs that the Prophet ﷺ has this kind of power or this level of knowledge or is present at all the Mawlid celebrations, if you look at the Quran, if you look at the Hadith, if you look at the early kind of widely accepted texts within the legal and theological schools, I'm not saying that these ideas don't have any kind of basis whatsoever. But these ideas clearly go, because you do have notions in very early Muslim texts of, let's say, tawassul, for instance, or the notion that prophets and saints can perform miracles, maybe even after their death. But the extent to which the Brailvis goes that they are basing themselves on later texts, later Islamic texts that are more controversial in character. The later texts that are more controversial in character and that are going to be criticized for this reason by these other movements like the Ahlul Hadith and the Deobandis. Brailvis, as I've indicated earlier, established educational institutions to propagate their views. After the Deobandis, they have the largest number of institutions. So in India, they have Misbah al-Ulum in Mubarakpur. They have Madrasa Mandar al-Islam in Brailvi. Barely established in 1904. They have Jamia Naimia in Muradabad, established in 1925. So they have a lot of their most important institutions were established around the year 1900. In Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you also have a number of important Braille institutions. And if you were to compare Brailleys with the Deobandis, Brailleys do have support for their views, to be honest, among major Islamic scholars. But they're major Islamic scholars that are maybe come later in Islamic history. Like if you talk about Islamic scholars who are living in 1300, 1400, 1500, 1600, if you're talking about figures like Suyuti or Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, many of them actually do express the type of beliefs that are endorsed by Brailleys. But from the perspective, but the Ahlul Hadith and the Deobandis are kind of more critical of these later developments that you find within Sunni thought. So from the Braillevi perspective, they would say, okay, they name themselves Ahlul Sunnah wal Jamaat, and they endorse a type of late phase Sunnism, late phase pre-modern Sunnism. But the Deobandis have a type of reformist agenda. I'm not using that in a negative sense at all, but the Braillevi or Deobandis and Ahlul Hadith are more skeptical. They have a kind of more critical stance of some of the developments that happened later in Islamic history, and are more believe that the religion should be more firmly anchored in kind of earlier views, and then also scriptural texts like the Quran.
Yeah, I think in the Deobandi sort of thought process, they accept that some of these ideas may be there, but there's also this care that there's this understanding there should be care that it doesn't slide into sort of this an extreme version of or it turns into some kind of bid'at. And a lot of it has to do with how things are practiced. For example, like you mentioned Maulid earlier, it's not as contentious as an issue as it became, simply because of how it was carried out, and it was starting to get more and more. It became like a third Eid within the religion, and it starts to become like almost more important than any other holiday, or the Eids, for example. So it was based on that, sliding towards that extreme, that the Deobandi school started to push back. And then when you have this, push forward and push back, it became like the Maulid became such a big issue at one point in Pakistan, or it probably still remains a big issue in that sense, even though technically Deobandis wouldn't necessarily write it off completely. Like you will still have a sort of understanding that, okay, this is an occasion, it's a good occasion to remember Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, to have a talk about his seerah around this time. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But then when they see the practices where these big celebrations are happening and extravagant, a lot of money is being spent and cakes are being baked, and all these practices where chairs are being put in certain majlises, they're saying that the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is going to attend tonight, and so those kind of things the Deobandis balked at and said that, or felt like this is not getting too far. So yeah, I think a lot of it came down to that practical, and then I guess there's the theological elements of Hazard Nazir and a few other issues where they remained at odds. Yeah, we're just pointing that it, where the tension is. It's a fine line, but it's kind of like Deobandis had this sort of conservatism that it kind of between what the Ahl Hadith were saying, and but they didn't completely reject everything necessarily from the other side. They had this sort of middle position, but that's why it also kind of, from the Ahl Hadith side, they always say that you guys are all the same, all Sufis, you're all the same. And the Badalwi side, they would say, well, you guys are just Ahl Hadith, you're just calling yourselves, So
yeah, they have this interesting intermediate position.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I had to say about South Asia. I mean, South Asia actually, probably of all the different regions of the Muslim world, in terms of the different strains that they have, they're quite well worked out. They're quite distinct from one another, and they have these long institutional histories. I mean, I would have mentioned Quranism as well as an interesting movement. But my understanding is they don't necessarily have, education. They haven't been influential in terms of establishing educational institutions. But I think anyone who wants to understand the range of reactions among Muslim communities to the challenge of liberal modernity, really South Asia is the best place to look. And South Asia was really kind of at the forefront of dealing with these issues compared to other regions.
Yeah, so and you also find that there are these, all of these, as you mentioned, it's these different reactions are all well thought out and they're all well established within South Asia. In other areas, you'll find a greater leaning towards one reaction as opposed to another. But Jazakumullah khair for that thorough overview of South Asia, inshallah, and we look forward to future podcasts, inshallah. We're going to explore more of the Muslim world, inshallah, and the dynamics of Islamic education throughout the Muslim world. Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Aria and Nakissa, for your time. And inshallah, we look forward to the next podcast. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam.